Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream on History Via Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor Dennis MacDonald, and today we're going to be continuing our discussion from where we left off last time. Last time, we were looking at a series of many parallels between Luke Acts and the Homeric epics. And today, we're going to be focusing more on Mark's use of Homer. So welcome back to the show, Dennis.
Well, thank you, Jacob. It's a pleasure always.
It's good to have you back. Here's the book, everybody. That's what the show is based on today. Must the synoptics remain a problem? I have the link to the History Valley Amazon affiliate link in the pinned in the comment in the live chat. It's pinned in there, and it's in the description below the video. With that being said, let's take us to the first slide. So we have Odysseus 10, 76, 135 to Mark 8, 10 to 13. So, Dennis, do you want
to go ahead?
Do you want to do what we did last time? You read one side and I read the other.
I think so, but yes, let's do that. But let me introduce this one.
Sure.
This is one of the more difficult ones to see, and it's not one of the strongest cases. So if people are, when we get done reading this, if people are skeptical, that's okay. In this case, you can see in the top columns that the Markan story has parallels to Homer's Odyssey, the story of the Laestrygonians. And I'll tell you that story as a backup story in a minute. But also there are echoes of the Logoi of Jesus, that is my reconstruction of the Q document. And frequently, Mark creates what I call mimetic hybrids, where he embeds a saying that he gets from the Christian tradition. Actually, it's a Jewish tradition because the Logoi of Jesus was written by a Jew, not a Christian. But he takes sayings of Jesus and embeds them inside of a narrative that comes from the Odyssey. Now, the story of the Laestrygonians goes like this. Odysseus and his crew, his flotilla of 12 ships, arrive in a foreign island, and he sends two of his men on a search party to find out who lived in on the island. And at first, they thought they would get a good welcome. They met a Laestrygonian woman drawing water, and she said, "Well, why don't you come and to my father's castle and or house and get welcome." So they did, but they turned out to be cannibals. And the cannibals then came to the harbor, the Limne, and slew all of Odysseus's men except for his own men. And they were saved because he wisely did not moor his ship inside this deadly harbor, but outside of it. The classicists sometimes see this harbor as similar to a fjord in the north, and in some cases, people in the north were considered to be cannibalistic or not very Greek. So that's the story. It's a story about cannibals. It's a story about about loss. It's a story about a deadly harbor. And so that's the background to this story. Now, the clue for me, Jacob, is in the right-hand column where you'd find on an American map, Maine. They go to a region that is called Dalmanutha. That comes from Aramaic, and it means of the harbor. You see the word limni, limnin at the end of it, and that's a part of the Dalmanutha. So it means of Dal, or no, of the lemon. Utha is a place name, so it's of the harbor, and that's the clue. But of course, most English readers don't know, wouldn't catch that wordplay, and even many Greeks may not have. But it's a very clever device. So anyway, let's read. And I know you're reading Greek these days, but let's pass by the Greek for the most part, and I can come back and visit it. So in the left column, Odysseus sailed with his crew and 12 ships for the region of the Lystrogonians. We went into the famous harbor. Odysseus moored his ship outside the harbor, but the other ships moored inside it.
Immediately he boarded the boat with his disciples and went into the region of the harbor, Dalmanutha from.
The Lystrogonians came thronging and killed all Odysseus's crew from the ships that had moored inside the harbor.
The Pharisees came out and began to question him. Mark's reader has known since chapter 3 that they wanted to kill Jesus.
From there we sailed on, grieved at heart, spared from death, but having lost our beloved comrades, we arrived at the island of Aiaia.
And groaning in his spirit, he said, "Why does this generation seek a sign?" He left them, again boarded the boat, and went off to the other side.
So you have this sailing. Now you can see that these parallels are rather thin, except for this business about the harbor. But Jacob, I want to stop and just make a comment here. You'll notice that in the left-hand column, the demons are cannibals. And Mark, unfortunately, is using that as a way of talking about Jews, Jewish authorities, the Pharisees. And Mark has done this with other characters, identifying them, for example, with Odysseus's suitors, Penelope's suitors. And one of the tragedies of the Gospels is their negative depiction of Jews. And they often, especially Mark, uses characters in Homeric epics that are scoundrels and uses those narratives to retell stories about Jews, especially Pharisees and scribes. Now, let's go to the next paragraph. Do you want to comment on that, Jacob?
I can see where the parallel is in the sense that it's as you said, that Mark is taking this this narrative from Homer's Odyssey, and he's making some changes, maybe a bit more changes to it than he usually does, which is probably why it's harder to see here. But I can see the elements he retains, in other words.
Yeah, and I think this is one element of early Christian anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism that people have not seen. That is the characterization of these of Jewish opponents of Jesus. It turns out that in Homer they're cannibals or they're scoundrels who are guilty of theft and all. It's just really awful. So let's go to the next part. The Markan evangelist used this Homeric narrative setting for his redaction of a brief episode in the Lost Gospel. Here's my translation. He boarded the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha of the harbor. And others, this is from the Q document, or Q plus Logoi of Jesus. And others said to him, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you."
And the Pharisees came out and began to question him, testing him, seeking from him a sign from heaven.
But in reply, he said to them, "An evil generation seeks a sign, and a sign will not be given to it except the sign of Jonah."
And groaning in his spirit, He said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation."
Now, those are striking similarities, Jacob.
Absolutely.
Yep. The seeking for a sign, a generation seeks a sign, no sign will be given it. Now, Mark makes this not having a sign even more striking, because at least the Q document allows for a sign of Jonah. Now, that's not the sign of him being coming out of the beast. It more likely is Jonah was one who had a mission to non-Jews. And so that seems to be the sign in the Q document. So this is an example, Jacob, of what I mean by mimetic hybrid. Mark has crafted a story that owes something to Homer and something to the lost gospel.
And so sometimes Mark will integrate the material he takes in from the Odyssey and or the Iliad and integrate it with material that he takes from the Logoi.
That's right, and that's well said. But there's another piece of it that's very important. In this case, Q scholars recognize that you have a bona fide Q statement. Matthew and Luke both have the seeking for a sign that comes after the Beelzebul controversy. And they recognize that Mark has a doublet to it, has an equivalent to it, but they would say that Mark does not know the Q document. He simply gets it from some other tradition. I don't think that's right. I think Mark knows the Q document and is using Homer as a way of putting it into a narrative. By the way, in Greek rhetoric, this phenomenon is well known. It's called a krea, where we might call it an anecdote. That is, it begins with an aphorism or a maxim, what the Greeks would call a gnomi. And so the maxim is there's no sign will be given to it. But in order to give it a little more context, the people were taught how to create narratives to introduce the gnomi. So this is an example of Mark using Homer to provide the narrative that ends with this gnomi, this maxim, so that the maxim now becomes an anecdote.
All right, so now we're into the next slide. We have Odyssey 9, 100 to 103, and 105 to 107 to Mark 8, 13, 15, and 22a.
Again, I think I should set a context for this story. There's a little story in the Odyssey of the Lotus eaters. And basically, you can think of them as a whole island full of drug users. And the men put in at the shore, and some of them go in to see who's there. And they run across these Lotus eaters, that is, these drug heads, and they forget about going home, and they don't want to leave. So I'll read the story as you have it on the slide, and then we'll see how Mark uses that. Odysseus's 12 ships moored at an unknown island again. The hero told Alcinous, the king of the Phaeacians, what happened there. I sent away my comrades to go and learn who these men were who ate bread. Whoever of them in the search party ate the honey-sweet fruit of the lotus no longer wanted to report again or to return home. But there with the lotus-eating men, they decided to stay dining on the Lotus to forget their nostos, their return home. And there you have the lathysthi, which is the word for forget. That has an equivalent in Mark. I myself forcibly brought them weeping back to the ships, and in the hollow ships I dragged them under the benches and tied them up. Then I ordered the rest of my faithful comrades eagerly to board the swift ships, so that no one, by eating the lotus, would forget, lathiti, his nostos, his return. Immediately they boarded and sat at the rowing benches, and sitting in order, they slapped the gray sea with their oars. For there we sailed from there we sailed further, grieved at heart. So Mark sails from Dalmanutha with the 12, who misunderstood his metaphor of the yeast of the Pharisees. He says, avoid the yeast of the Pharisees. And they realized that they had forgotten epilathonta, it's a compound verb from lanthanomai, to bring bread with them on the boat, except for one loaf. So here you have an issue of eating and of forgetfulness. Jesus then rebukes them for forgetting that he could multiply loaves to feed thousands. He had included his metaphor to warn against eating the leavened bread of the foes, that is, as a metaphor, lest they forget their stated commitment to follow him. The leavened bread of the Pharisees was lotus-like in Mark's opinion. After Jesus's rebuke, they arrive at Bethsaida. So again, I'll read the left and you can read the right. Odysseus tells Alcinous, I ordered the rest of my faithful commandments quickly to board the swift ships.
He left them again, and let me start over. He left them again, boarded the boat, and went off to the other side.
And the roots for those verbs are the same, either embino or embino, epibino or embino. Next page. So that no one by eating the lotus would forget his nostos. Immediately, and so on.
And because they had overlooked bringing bread with them on the boat, they only had one loaf.
They boarded. From there we sailed further, grieved at heart, and to the land of the Cyclopes we came.
And sailing in their boat, they came to Bethsaida.
The verb epilanthanami appears in Mark only here. The verb lanthano appears twice in the Homeric story. Those who ate the flower of the lotus forgot about returning home. Both stories contrast folly of the crew with the wisdom of the hero. But then we have, again, a use of a saying that appears in my reconstruction in the Q document. Because they'd forgotten to take bread with them on the boat, they had only one loaf. But this is what one found in the Q document. And he began to say to his disciples, keep yourselves from the yeast of the Pharisees.
And he commanded them, saying, pay attention and watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod.
So he adds the tag and the yeast of Herod. But you can see the underlining, and I'll read the Greek here, which you could do too, which is exactly the same. Apatis zimis ton Pharisaion, from the yeast of the Pharisees. It's identical. So here we have another mimetic hybrid.
Yeah.
Mark has taken the aphorism, the gnomi, keep yourselves from the yeast of the Pharisees, and made it into a crea, or an anecdote, by setting it up with the narrative that comes from Homer. Very clever. And by the way, as far as I know, no one has seen this phenomenon and reported on it.
Yeah, it's practically little to no difference in the Greek being used there. Yeah.
Yep.
And now we're at Odyssey 16 and Mark 9.
This is a famous story, both in the Odyssey and in Mark, and most people have not recognized the similarities. I need again to set up the background. When Odysseus gets home, Athena transforms him into a beggar so that he is not going to be detected by the suitors. That allows him to mill around the feasting suitors and to pile up their guilt before he kills them. And then he is going to kill them at the end. But Athena says, look, you really need to reveal yourself to your son, Telemachus. And he can help you with the suitors. He loves you. He's not going to be traitorous. And so she transforms him, it transfigures him into himself. And Telemachus thinks he must be some god because now he doesn't look the same, and he offers to sacrifice to him. And then Odysseus says, no, I'm not a god, I'm your father. And then they decide what to do with the suitors. Odysseus then becomes a tramp again, and he commands Telemachus not to tell anybody. Now, in the Markan story, this is the transfiguration of Jesus. Jesus has been keeping his identity as the Son of God as a secret. This is often called the messianic secret, which is unfortunate. It's not the best thing to call it. And so he then is transformed, and the disciples who see this want to offer sacrifices to him, to build shrines to him and Moses and Elijah. But then a voice comes and says, this is my son, my beloved son. In other words, there's a declaration of who Jesus' father is. His father is God. And then Jesus tells them to tell nobody. So that's the background for both of these. And it's really quite amazing. And we're going to see that this is another mimetic doublet because you have a Q equivalent. So let's read these parallels against Jacob. Odysseus was alone with Telemachus. Now remember, Odysseus and Jesus both kept their identities secrets against their enemies. So Odysseus was alone with Telemachus.
Jesus was alone with Peter, Jacob, and John.
Athena transformed Odysseus and dressed him in a well-washed cloak.
Jesus' garments became dazzling white to a degree that no launderer on earth could bleach them.
No launderer on earth could bleach them? In other words, it's a divine laundry, right? And that's what you have at Athena. She dresses him in a well-washed cloak. That cannot be an accident. All right. Surely, Telemachus says, surely you are some god, one of those who hold broad heaven. Have mercy, so that we may offer you pleasing sacrifices. Spare us.
Peter says, allow us to build 3 booths, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, because he did not know how to answer, for they were terrified.
So they're terrified, and they want to create booths or shrines. Again, that can't be accidental. Odysseus answered him, you may be sure I am no god. I'm your father.
A voice came from the cloud. This is my beloved son.
Odysseus demanded that Telemachus keep his identity a secret. Let no one, Metis, hear that Odysseus has come home.
Jesus ordered them to tell no one, Medeni, what they had seen, except what the Son of Man would be raised from the dead.
Because then it would be okay to reveal it, because Jesus would already be dead. Whatever would happen to him would have happened by then. Now, what follows in my translation of Mark's version of the Transfiguration has another nod to the lost gospel. So in the temptation, the devil took him along to Jerusalem and put him on the top of the temple, and the devil took him along on a high mountain. The issue here is the verb paralambani.
And after, let me start over. And after 6 days, Jesus took along paralambane, Peter, Jacob, and John, and...
Yeah. Next slide. Ooh, is that the next slide?
Hold on 1 second. That's weird.
Well, I can look it up, Jacob, in the book and just read it. Why don't I do that?
No, I can get it in here. I just don't know what happened.
Okay.
Yeah, just give me a second.
Well, let me just finish this square that's on this page 84 at the bottom. And brought them to a high mountain. So both in the Transfiguration story and in the temptation story, Jesus takes along people to a high mountain. And the wording is identical.
Yep. Okay, I'm about to get this issue fixed right now. All right. Here it is.
Yeah, there it is. And so he's transformed before them. But let's go then to the next squares. Jesus came from Galilee and was baptized. The skies were opened, and he saw the Spirit descending upon him. And a voice came from the skies, "You are my beloved Son." So now in the temptation story, and in this case, the baptism that came before the temptation story, we have this statement, "You are my beloved Son." What do we have in Mark?
We have, and a cloud appeared overshadowing them. And a voice came from the cloud, "This is my beloved Son."
And there you can see the Greek, which is almost identical. So Mark has his own story of the baptism, but creates the story of the Transfiguration so that Jesus's closest disciples get the same information that the reader has known about. That is, that Jesus is keeping his identity as the Son of God a secret, but now it gets revealed by the voice from the sky or from the cloud. So this is another example of mimetic doublets, where Mark has created the scene of the Transfiguration from the Odyssey. Now, I want to get myself in trouble here. The Transfiguration story obviously never happened, not just because it's a miracle, but we can tell what Mark is doing literarily and theologically. So forget talking about the Transfiguration as some memory of an epiphany or something like that. No, it's mimesis. And it's showing that Jesus is actually more powerful than Odysseus, because Telemachus's father is Odysseus. Jesus's father is God. That's called a syncresis.
Yep. You ready to go to the next slide?
I am, but I just want to tell you that I appreciate that you've chosen these examples, because they're marvelous examples of how you get this mimetic hybrid, that Mark is an equal opportunity imitator. He gets some things from the sayings tradition related to Q, and he puts it into an epic format so that the gnomi, the wisdom sayings, in this case, this is my beloved son, is now put into a new narrative. And the narrative comes from one of the best known poems in classical antiquity, namely the Odyssey. Do you have any comments about that? I mean, I'm really impressed by these examples.
Yeah, I am too. I think it's one of the best ones.
Yeah, I'm glad you chose them.
Yeah.
Oh, let me say one more thing about these while this is up. In the squares in the middle of the page, you see the statement, "You are my beloved son," and that appears in both squares, right? The word beloved does not appear in Psalm 2:7. It simply says the voice from heaven declares the king to be his son, but not his beloved son. And the adjective for that is agapitos, which becomes a noun, agapitos. No, it's still an adjective. My son, the beloved one, that's for an emphasis. Telemachus is repeatedly called Odysseus's agapitas pes or agapitas huios. He is the beloved son. And again, people have not seen that this word agapitos is not coming from Judaism. It's coming from the Odyssey, where Telemachus is the beloved son, the agapitos.
Yeah. So now back to the madness of Heracles and Mark 9:14-19.
Oh, this one is one of my favorites, but it's extremely complex. And again, I'm going to have to give you the background story. Well, I guess we can read it at the top of the page. That's the background to it. And if you don't mind, I'll let you read it. In a rage, the demented hero
killed his sons and Megara his wife. Athena then threw a stone at Heracles' chest, which stopped his crazed labor and put him to sleep. He fell to the ground.
Amphitryon.
Amphitryon, fearing that Athena's blow had killed him, shoved aside the chorus, saying, "Quiet, let me detect his breath. Come, let me put my ear to him." Heracles then woke, shocked that his family lay dead, when his father told him that he himself had killed them. He recognized the wrath of Hera. While I was still sucking milk in my swaddling clothes, the wife of Zeus sent fierce-eyed serpents so that I might be destroyed, because her husband had sired him from Alcmene, comparing the following.
Okay, so let's compare the following. Heracles, the son of Zeus, returned to his family from the realm of Hades, where he would have seen the dead.
Jesus, the Son of God, returned to his disciples after having spoken with two dead men, stopping mountain.
That is right, the Transfiguration. During his absence, his family Heracles' family faced a crisis. No one was able to protect them from the tyrant Lycus.
During his absence, the disciples faced a crisis. They were unable to exorcise a pernicious demon from a man's son.
When Heracles entered Thebes, his father and wife were amazed when they saw that he had returned from Hades. Megara told her boys to run to their father, their savior.
As soon as the entire crowd saw him, they were astonished, ran to him, and welcomed him.
Heracles then asked them what was happening.
And he asked them, "Why are you disputing with them?"
His father said that he and Heracles' wife and sons were about to be slain.
And someone from the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought my son to you. He has a spirit that renders him mute. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him down. He frogs, grinds his teeth, and collapses."
Heracles' friends had been unable to help his family.
And I asked your disciples to expel it, but they were not strong enough to do so.
The inability of Thebans to oust Lycus was a collective failure.
He responded by saying, "O untrustworthy generation, how long am I to be with you? How long will I put up with you? Bring him to me."
From this point on, Mark's Jesus no longer resembles Heracles. Instead, that role falls to the deaf demoniac whom Jesus exorcises. He stood there in silence. He no longer was as he had been. He was contorted by the rolling.
When the spirit saw him, it immediately convulsed him, i.e. the mute, and he fell to the earth. And
his eyes and developed bloodshot eyes, froth, aphron, dribbled down his handsome beard.
rolled around, frothing at the mouth.
Basically the same word, just as a verb.
Yep.
Heracles, while he was still sucking milk in my swaddling clothes, while I was still sucking milk in my swaddling clothes, the wife of Zeus, Hera, sent fierce-eyed serpents so that I might be destroyed.
And Jesus asked his father, "How long has he been like this?" He said, "From his youth, and often it throws him into the fire or the water to destroy him."
Amphitryon had asked Heracles to help them.
"But have pity on us and help us if you can."
Athena threw a stone at Heracles' chest, which stopped his crazed labor and put him to sleep, and he fell to the ground. His father Amphitryon feared that he had died.
Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to him, "Mute and deaf spirit, I order you, come out of him, and never enter him again." And the demon cried out, threw him into a violent fit, and came out. And the boy was like a corpse, prompting many to say that he had died.
When Heracles finally came to his senses, he marveled, "I am alive."
But Jesus took the lad's hand, pulled him up, and he arose. The disciples marveled at his cure.
Whereas the demon in Euripides struck Heracles with frothing madness, Jesus in Mark casts a demon from a frothing madman. The evangelist apparently expected his readers to appreciate Jesus' compassion when compared to Hera's cruelty. This is another syncresis. Even Euripides' Heracles complained, "To such a God who would ever pray." The most distinctive parallels pointing to Mark's mimetic rivalry are absent in Matthew and Luke. And this is an important chart Jacob. I'm so glad you had it. I'm going to read the left-hand column piece by piece, and Mark, and then you'll do Mark, Jacob. And I want readers to see that in Matthew and Luke, some of the most distinctive markers to Euripides are missing in Matthew and Luke. This is a major reason for arguing for Markan priority. You would never see the parallels to Euripides if you only had Matthew and Luke. So Heracles visits Hades.
Jesus speaks with the dead.
A crisis arises in his absence.
A crisis arises in his absence.
But Matthew and Luke do not have the next piece. His sons run to meet him.
The crowd runs to meet him.
And they don't have this. Heracles asks about the problem.
Jesus asks about the problem.
Thebans were helpless.
Disciples were helpless.
Heracles stood there in silence.
The afflicted boy was mute.
Missing in Matthew and Luke. A demon makes Heracles froth at the mouth.
The demon makes the boy froth at the mouth.
That's missing in Matthew. Hera had afflicted him from his birth to destroy him.
It had afflicted him from yoke to destroy him.
Notice that's missing in Matthew and Luke. That's really important. Athena stops him with the stone.
Jesus exorcises the demon.
Heracles falls to the ground to sleep.
The boy falls, resembling a corpse.
It's missing in Matthew and Luke, as is the next one. His father thinks that he has died.
Many say that he had died.
Heracles awakes grateful to be alive, but is horrified at what he had done.
Jesus lifts him from the ground, and the disciples marvel.
In other words, that's good news as opposed to bad news. Now, if the story survived only in Matthew and Luke, the resemblance to Euripides' tragedy would be invisible because the most distinctive markers are gone. They've stripped those distinctive markers and made it a simple exorcism story. Now, I don't know what you have in the next slide, but this story in Mark also has echoes with the Q document.
Let's take a look. We got Odyssey 6 and 7 to Mark.
Yeah, and so that's a different story, but not to worry about it. Just to say that if in the book, if you read the next page or two, you'd see that there are also echoes of the Q document. But we're especially interested in the Odyssey. Now, let me ask a question of you, Jacob. If we only saw one or two of these examples, you might say, oh, yeah, I mean, that's curious. But when you have so many of them, it really cries out for a change of methodological paradigms. This is a revolutionary shift in how we understood gospel composition. And it both makes the evangelists smart and educated and clever, but it also makes them somewhat questionable in terms of being reliable and some of the things that the way they're portraying Jews, for example, is hardly, or at least Mark is hardly flattering.
Yep.
And I think that what I just expressed is a way of talking about my frustration that the field seems to be so tone deaf to these kinds of parallels. And I don't think you can explain them in any other way other than a strategic and a clever mimesis.
Yeah, I agree. So shall we go back and forth here like before?
Oh, this one, yes. I failed to notice that we have a new screen. Let's see if, yeah, let me give a little background to this one too. Odyssey Book 5 is Odysseus' famous shipwreck, where on his way from Calypso's island, he's trying to make his way home. Poseidon sees him and causes a storm that almost kills him. Athena again comes to his assistance, as does a deity named Leucothea. And he finally gets to the shore of the Phaeacians, but he's destitute, he's nude, he stripped off his clothing so he could swim better. He's haggard. He's been at sea for many days and is famished, and he's looking for hospitality. And he arrives at the shore of the Phaeacians, and he's going to get some assistance from the princess of the Phaeacians, Nausicaa. So we have in Mark 11, Jesus arriving in Judea, basically Jerusalem, where he's never been before. And he's going to be seeking some hospitality. So let's give it a shot. Odysseus arrived on the island of the Phaeacians, entirely bereft after his shipwreck.
Jesus arrived in Judea without money or a host.
Athena told Nausicaa to ask her father for mules and a wagon.
Jesus told two of his disciples to find a colt and bring it to him.
Nausicaa told her father she needed a wagon to do her wash.
The disciples told those with the colt, the Lord has need of it.
Her father granted Nausicaa the mules.
The owners allowed them to take it.
She folded the clothes and put them on the beautiful wagon, yoked the strong-hoofed mules, and mounted herself.
They brought the colt to Jesus and put their clothes over it, and he sat on it.
Nausicaa's mule cart led the way. Then came Odysseus on foot, hidden among the slave women.
Some of those escorting Jesus into Jerusalem walked ahead and others behind.
Odysseus traveled through the fields.
Some in the crowd brought branches cut from the fields.
Odysseus, though a king, entered the city wearing someone else's clothing behind a mule wagon carrying laundry.
Jesus, though the Son of God, entered the city humbly, riding on someone else's beast of burden with clothing for a saddle.
Nausicaa viewed Odysseus as Nausicaa's arrival as the will of the gods. Phaeacians esteemed him as a god.
The crowd shouted, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord."
And that, Jacob, is a cue saying. People recognize that as a part of the curses on Jerusalem. And now it's placed in Jerusalem. And so the blessed one who is the one who comes in the name of the Lord no longer is eschatological. It's not his coming in the future, but his arrival, ironically, his arrival in Jerusalem. He entered the city late in the day.
On entering the temple late in the day,
Odysseus just stood there gawking. And when he had gawked at Panta, everything,
Jesus looked around at everything, Panta.
Among the marvels was the garden of Alcinous with its fig trees that bore even out of season, fig after fig.
The next day, he cursed a fig tree, Sukin, for bearing no fruit, even though it was not the season for figs, Sukom.
Yeah. So people have wondered, even in antiquity, why should he curse a fig tree if it's not fig season? that's not fair to a fig tree. Well, it is if you're comparing it to the garden of Elkinowis. Give me a break. That has got to be an intertextual signal. And here you have the aphorism, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, inside of a context of imitations of Homer. This is a beautiful example, I think, Jacob.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely. So now we're at Odyssey 19, 296 and 302, and 305 to 307 to Mark 13, 28 to 30.
I see. This is in Mark. Jesus is telling four of his disciples who are asking for signs of the time, what they should be looking for. And in the Odyssey, Odysseus, still in disguise, is answering Penelope's question, what are going to be the signs that her husband might be returning? So that's the context of these. So Odysseus says this, Phaedon, the king of Thesprotians, had told the beggar that Odysseus himself went to Dodona to hear the will of Zeus from the divine oak tree with lofty foliage.
Learn a parable from the fig tree. As soon as its branch becomes tender and it sprouts leaves,
how he might return to his beloved homeland, openly or secretly, after having been gone for so long.
You know that the summer is near.
So he is safe and will come very soon, for not long will he be far from his loved ones and homeland.
So also when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the gates.
Nevertheless, I give you my oath, surely all these things will come to pass. Tadapanta telati, just as I say. At the departure of the light, Odysseus will come here between the waning and waxing of the moon.
I tell you truly that this generation will by no means pass away until all these things take place. Tota, Panta,
Gemetai.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The sun will be darkened.
And the next boxes we don't have to read, but now you have learned the parable of the fig tree and so on. You know that the end is coming. This is a paraphrase of what you find in the Lost Gospel. Take a look at the weather. This is, how to interpret the sky and the weather, but not the times, what's going on in the times. So this is another example. Let me ventilate our discussion just a little bit. And I don't know if you have any viewers who want to chat a bit. But one is, I am so disappointed that so many Christians think that the Gospels are historical. And they're missing the fun. They really are missing the meaning of these things. Because what we find in the Gospels is not a record of history, but it's a cultural engagement with Judaism and with classical Greek poetry. So to read the Gospels in a literal way, looking for history, is to misread these texts. And if you value the texts, study the texts. And I hate to be so explicit, but I get so tired of people posturing themselves and arguing for the inerrancy of the Bible and so on. Well, I'm sorry, that's just anti-intellectualism and it's stupid. And it's not helping religion.
So now we're at Odyssey 10, 476 to 560 to Mark 14, 17 to 42.
Let's see the context of this. Yeah, this is the story of the Last Supper. This is where Jesus has his final meals with the disciples. It also has some echoes with Socrates' last meal with his friends on the day he dies. But here we've got the parallels for the Odyssey. So Odysseus wants to leave Circe's island with his crew in order to get home to Ithaca. They've been there for a year, and his men are really chafing to get moving. So Circe provided Odysseus and his crew a bountiful meal that included wine.
Jesus and his disciples observed the Passover, including wine.
After the meal, while his crew slept, Odysseus spent the night with Circe, asking her to send him on his way home.
After the meal, while his disciples slept, Jesus spent evening time in prayer, asking for the cup to pass from him, viz. His death.
Odysseus learned that he must go to Hades. He despaired of life. Even so, he resigned himself to his fate. Notice the irony. He when he learns he must go to Hades, he wants to go to Hades.
Jesus knew that he had to die and was distressed unto death. Even so, he resigned himself to his fate.
Odysseus came to his sleeping crew and woke them. Now stop sleeping, though sunk in sweet sleep. Let's go.
Jesus came to his sleeping disciples and woke them. Are you going to sleep from now on and take your rest? Enough, arise, let's go.
Odysseus left to consult dead Tiresias.
Jesus left for his trial and execution.
Even though Mark crafted his Gethsemane episode after Odyssey 10, one also finds evidence of his reliance on the lost gospel. Two logia likely inform Mark's portrayal of Jesus' prayer to his Father before his first temptation by the devil immediately after his baptism. Mark wrote his own version of the episode, but omitted the content of the temptations. At Gethsemane, of course, Jesus prays 3 times with faint echoes of Logoi. The second relevant logon is the disciples' Lord's Prayer. I don't know if you have the next page. I don't think it's important. But just to say that this is another example of Mark using narrative from Homer to be the host of his use of statements coming from the lost gospel, the Logoi of Jesus. Oh, yeah, that's really helpful. I have, as you know, because you worked with my book so much, I have diagrams like this all over the place. And so let's begin in the northeast corner. Odysseus's anguish before going to Hades informed Jesus's prayer at Gethsemane and his Last Supper. Okay. Matthew and Luke rewrite it and therefore have their own version of Mark's prayer at Gethsemane. But the Logoi of Jesus in the temptations and in the so-called Lord's Prayer or Disciples' Prayer influenced Mark. Mark knows that and uses that as some of the theological freight that he wants to carry. And we know that that there was such a thing because Matthew and Luke have their own version of Jesus's temptations and the Lord's Prayer, Disciples' Prayer. In other words, Matthew and Luke have doublets. They one time they're borrowing from the Lost Gospel, the other time they're borrowing from Mark. This is a major reason why I think the Q plus Papias hypothesis has got to be the right solution. It explains so much about the intertextuality of the Gospels. Mark's priority, Matthew and Luke coming later, and they duplicate content because Mark already has an imitation of the Logo of Jesus. So this kind of mapping, I hope, makes the complexity of gospel intertextuality clearer. But I probably have 30 such diagrams in the book. And actually, I think all of the ones we talked about have maps like this.
So here you talk about Dolios, or the son of Dolios, Melanthius. And let me see here.
Jacob?
Yeah.
Could we do away with the slides for just a minute and talk to each other?
Yeah.
I think your viewers have seen a lot of data for these, a lot of very good examples that you've selected. But you know that my work is marginalized and I'm considered a maverick.
Yeah, I know.
And give me your impression about where we should be putting our efforts. Is it in looking at parallels like this? Is it to be debating with other people who have the synoptic problem on their minds? Many people who don't like my work don't like the Q hypothesis. They think that we don't need to have a Q document. I think these examples make it quite clear that there's got to be a source of Jesus's sayings out there that are used by all of the Gospels. And other people don't like the Homeric imitations. And I think the reason the synoptic problem has not been solved for almost 2,000 years has to do with the lack of two keys to answering the synoptic problem. And the title of my book has a subtitle that I want to highlight. The subtitle is Two Keys for Unlocking Gospel Intertextuality. And both keys are suspect by many scholars. And if you don't have both keys, I don't think you can answer the synoptic problem. The first key is Mark's mimesis of the Epia of Homer, that is, the epics of Homer. If you don't acknowledge that, the rest of the stuff isn't going to pop up at you. But the second key is Mark's mimesis also of the Logoi of Jesus, the Q document. But you have to have other criteria for getting to the Q document. And the reason the Q is in intensive care, and that's a dominant metaphor in this book, the reason it's in intensive care is that people who set out a century ago to reconstruct Q made two significant mistakes. One is they denied that Luke knows Matthew. Luke knows Matthew. So Matthew-Luke overlaps, at least conceptually, can be understood to be Luke's use of Matthew. The other problem is the assumption that Mark did not know Q. But what we've seen in these examples is that there are lots of examples of Mark knowing Q, some of which are disguised inside of narratives because of this mimetic material. So I have to be conscious. I'm 77 years old. I'm not going to live forever. And I'm pretty sure that that the dial is not going to move in my lifetime where there's more acceptance of this material. Now, one of the reasons that I love to be on your show, your podcasts, and Myth Vision and elsewhere, is this gives me an opportunity outside of the guild to talk about these projects. And for me, they're thrilling. And I think they're actually politically important. And that part I haven't explored so much. But I wonder if you have any thoughts about where we can go with this, or what is the next, what do you think, where do you think most of the resistance is coming from? Is there any hope for this kind of research?
I think those are interesting questions because while you'll have people in different, you're different. Let me just put it this way: you have people that have their own view on how to solve the synoptic problem, and usually when they make up their mind and they say, okay, this is what I believe. Here's the order. Here's what used what, and they don't usually change their minds. Sometimes, but not always. And I think that the resistance to the parallels, to the kind of parallels that you're talking about, comes from perhaps they are disturbed at the lack of originality in the synoptics, especially in Mark, considered to be the first gospel, at least first of the four gospels in the New Testament. And so the less Mark is original, the less of it is historical. So I think in a sense that, okay, we can know less about Jesus, regardless of one is believing in it from a theological point of view or from a secular point of view. We know less about Jesus because more of what was thought to be original in Mark actually derives from Homer.
Okay, original in Mark, you mean original in the tradition, going back to Jesus himself, as opposed to Mark's own literary originality. So I think
I
that's
guess it's a mix of both, but yeah.
So I think one of the things that I think is unfortunate is that we have removed the gospel authors from their own creativity and not listened to their own voices. And that's why the next book I'm doing, which is coming along really quite nicely, is called Synoptic Epistles and Homeric Epics. And it's my apocryphal letters of the gospel authors writing to each other about what they don't like about their work and how they explain their own. And it's amazing how fundamentally they disagree with each other. And what happens in Christian theology and also in scholarship is what I would call unhistorical homogenizing. That they're really all trying to say the same thing. They agree with each other more or less. Of course, they're very different. They have different social settings, but they're not really arguing with each other. And the job of theology is to harmonize, what I would call homogenizing. So Krister Stendhal, one of my teachers, put it this way: you'll never get cheese or butter from homogenized milk. And so what I'm trying to do is to find where the butter and the cheese are. And theologians can do the homogenizing. But I think homogenizing these texts is an ahistorical and unhealthy thing to do. And it's much better to deal with the diversity of these voices instead of trying to make false homogenized versions of it.
What do you think about the criticism of that they often put out there that, okay, Luke did not know Matthew, because if Luke did know Matthew, how come he didn't copy Luke's more elaborative double tradition material? Because in the two source theory, they typically say Luke's version of it is more often more primitive than Matthew's version. So how come if Luke knew Matthew, he didn't copy Matthew's more elaborative material?
Well, I think you've answered your own question. If you say that Luke frequently has earlier material, where is he getting it from? Is he getting it from oral tradition? Is he getting it from multiple sources, or is he getting it from a single source? So the very fact that, and by the way, this is one of the great advances of the two-document hypothesis. When they evaluated Matthew and Luke, looking for the earliest reading, we should not be challenging places where they see Luke as more original. Where the FAR hypothesis and other people come along and say, but you can't be sure when Matthew is earlier that he's not just using Matthew and redacting Matthew. So this is hard. This is methodologically difficult for a lot of people to grasp. But the Q project was a way of asking which is earlier, Matthew or Luke. When they were able to identify with their criteria where Luke is earlier, they're right. But when you have cases where Matthew is earlier, you can't be so sure that Luke is using Matthew or a lost gospel. So that's the answer. But people don't want to give up their hypotheses. This is true of everybody that's got the synoptic problem on their mind. There's an intransigence. And of course, I'm intransigent too. So I'm going to be dogmatic with my position unless I can see evidence that makes me think otherwise.
Well, I think we can close here. And in the next part, I would like to dive into more parallels between Mark and the Homeric epics.
Okay, sure.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dennis.
Thank you, Jacob. Take care.
Yeah, you too.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.